If you go to the Software Engineering Process Group, or SEPG conference, or any other process improvement conference, you hear certain terms like SPI, Software Process Improvement, and you also hear recurring themes throughout the conference. The first of those is securing senior management sponsorship. Those are the guys with the big bucks. Those are the guys that will provide the leadership, hopefully, for your process improvement initiative. What we typically find is if it's a grassroots movement, it will be inadequately funded and certainly inadequately staffed. So those are relatively short duration efforts. So you really need to secure senior management sponsorship and make sure that you have the right people leading the effort. They have the resources to put into play, and then set this thing up as a project, which is the second recurring theme that you hear. So typically if you have a group called the SEPG, Software Engineering Process Group, or whatever your process improvement group is called, they should have an appointed project manager type person, typically called the SEPG leader. There should be other membership on the team, which essentially serve as the project team members for the process improvement project. And then they may launch smaller initiatives, smaller process action teams or technical working groups. But the whole thing should run like a project. They should have timelines. They should have deliverables. They should be held accountable for making the same kind of progress that you would expect a software development project to make. The third frequent theme that you hear is that you need to rely on internal resources. You can go out and find resources that you can bring in and have them run your process improvement project, but it really is about finding the most effective and efficient way to get your work done. And the people that are most knowledgeable about the ways to do that are the people sitting there in your desk doing the work themselves. Now, I would caution you as an external consultant that treat that last one carefully. There are roles to be played where it's appropriate to bring in an external person, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But when you go to the conferences, you hear these recurring themes, and sometimes you walk out just wondering to yourself, okay, I understand that information, but what specifically should we start doing today? And are there things that people have done in the past that haven't worked out so well? And armed with that knowledge, perhaps there are things that we should avoid doing. So what I did was I looked at the kinds of activities I saw that were working and the kinds of things that were coming up with suboptimal results, and packaged up a series of what I consider the do's and don'ts for process improvement. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Again, before we get started, we have to have a couple caveats here, and I'm borrowing a couple of Jerry Weinberg's favorite caveats. The first is organizational dichotomy. Jerry's come to the conclusion that no two organizations are identical, so advice given to one may not fit all organizations. But the other thing that's interesting as you visit multiple organizations is no two organizations are completely different. I faced a hostile audience at one point in my career when I was doing a 5-day training course, and as we're going through the introductions, just going around the table for the first time, one of the project managers in the course asked me specifically, what do I know about their particular application domain, which happened to be embedded software that went on the space shuttle. And I said, hold that question at least till we get through the introductions, and then I'll come back and address that question. Now, fortunately, in the introductions, one of the things I'd asked them for was, what are the key stumbling blocks in your organization for keeping you from being productive and effective and efficient? And the kinds of things we were hearing, we were writing on the flip chart, and they were things like dictated schedules and limited budgets and limited training and all kinds of process-related issues. So after we got through the introduction bit, I turned to the flip chart, and I went through the issues, and I said, how many of these are specifically targeted towards your application domain, your engineering discipline of embedded software that goes on the space shuttle? Let's assume that you understand the application domain and technology aspects. We understand the process approaches that will help you overcome some of these issues. And we reached agreement on that, and fortunately we were able to have a very productive class. No two organizations are completely different. I could have written most of what I was going to hear in that particular introduction session. I could have written those on the flip chart before we run around the room, because you do tend to hear the same kinds of things recurring over and over in organizations, so they really aren't completely different. The other caveat I'd like to put forward is Weinberg's law of raspberry jam, which essentially says the broader you spread it, the thinner you get. This session covers 10 specific do's and don'ts. Actually, it covers 12, but one of them was measurement, so I thought putting 10 here would be a very subtle piece of humor that people probably wouldn't catch unless I brought it to their attention. But with 12 specific do's and don'ts that we're going to cover, my hope is that 2 or 3 of them ring true for you, and you have that aha moment that says, oh man, that hits so home that we really need to address that starting now. And if it's a do, it's something that you should positively work on. If it's a don't, perhaps it's an activity that you ought to curtail and think about doing something different with the hope that those would provide benefits to you. And so the other 8 or 9 or 10 do's and don'ts, these are intended for a friend of yours, not necessarily directly at you. So the categories that we're going to cover, I have 6 do's and don'ts that touch on senior management, 3 that focus on the model themselves, 2 that focus on measurement, and let's see, I said there were 10, but overall there's 12. This adds up to 11. Oh yeah, and there's one that we conclude the presentation with to make sure that you get one final piece of advice that you may find useful. So let's start with the group of senior management do's and don'ts. And I do have slide material that covers each of these, so I'll just read them through once, and then we'll get right to the individual treatment of these do's and don'ts. So the first one is don't treat the level as the goal. And many of you may recognize that as one of the key pain points in the way you're trying to perform CMMI process improvement. The second one is do establish this thing I call the alignment principle, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that when we get to the slides. Do take your time getting faster. That seems to be a rather odd statement. Do align the reward system. Remember, we're talking to senior management here. They control the reward system, and that's one of the most powerful tools at their discretion. Do, again, for senior management, do ask different questions that you've asked in the past. And then finally, don't let the dip get you down, and you'll see what we mean by that when we get to that point. In some cases, one of the interesting things I see is that process improvement people complain a lot about the lack of senior management sponsorship within their process improvement initiative. And my first question to those people is, what have you specifically asked senior management to do on your behalf? And they typically respond, we shouldn't have to ask, they should know. But the trick here is we're talking about organizational change management, and it's not something that senior management does on a day-to-day basis. So we as process improvement people really have to lead senior management down the path, help them understand their role in this new project, and these are the kinds of slides that will help them understand that. So the first one is don't treat the level as the goal. If I were to ask for a show of hands how many people are doing that, I'm sure I would get a fair number of people on this webinar putting their hand up. But the question to senior management is, what are you really trying to achieve? The CMMI is one of many tactical approaches to help organizations achieve a business strategy. So senior management should be focused on the business strategy and allow organizational groups like a software engineering process group to serve as the tactical unit to implement CMMI or some other process improvement approach to help them achieve the business strategy. Unfortunately, too often, the tactic, the CMMI and the achievement of maturity levels, gets confused with the strategy. So the questions of senior management is, what is your business imperative? How do your customers evaluate your products? What's going on in the mind of the customer when they decide to use your competitor as their supplier rather than you? So let's get inside the heads of the customers and figure out what's going on in that decision-making process. When I do this in front of a live audience and